Hello guys and welcome back to FATBOSS TV. Today we're looking at Il'gynoth the Corruption Reborn in Ny'alotha.
So this is one of our favourite fights in the instance, and whilst it does have some similarities to the Emerald Nightmare version of the fight, it doesn't feel like the same fight at all. This two-phase encounter is primarily defeated by making the most of your space within the room, whilst being quick to swap to adds before they reach their targets. Mechanically there is very little to talk about, so this should be a relatively quick video, but that doesn't mean that it's an easy encounter. Anyway, let's jump straight into it and talk about Phase 1.
So for tanks you'll be hit with Eye of N'Zoth. This is a beam fired directly at you, dealing large shadow damage and increasing the damage you take from this ability by 75%. You'll want to use a cooldown for the second hit and taunt swap afterwards. Now one of the most important abilities in the fight is Corruptor's Gaze. This targets multiple raid members spawning underneath them, and shortly after a beam will follow those targets, leaving behind patches in their wake. This beam really hurts and so do the patches, so it's important that you avoid them. There are lots of different strategies with dealing with these beams, but what we found to work well was stacking the entire raid near the boss. Every time the beam came in, we would then move as a single unit all the way to the opposite side of the boss using either a gateway or a speed totem. This causes the beams to be stacked, but also makes the beams go directly underneath the boss, which is an area of the encounter that players cannot enter as you just get knocked back from it. Now the only issue with this stack strategy is the touch of the Corruptor. When this cast is finished, random raid members become mind controlled and will begin to run towards other players. If they reach you, then you'll become mind controlled also. So this spreads like a plague and eventually the entire raid will be charmed. The only way to break this effect is to get the player down to 30% health. Players can however be crowd controlled. Whilst testing Heroic, this mechanic wasn't an issue because we could just use Tremor Totem to instantly remove the effect, allowing us to remain stacked. For Mythic testing this wasn't the case, Tremor Totem just flat out didn't work, and we're guessing it won't work for any difficulty come live servers. So instead, you're forced to spread and instantly stun and kill off any players that are mind controlled. This does however overlap with beams, so the stack strategy for that particular set doesn't work very well. Now before us explaining other strategies, it's probably best to understand how Phase 2 works.
So once the boss reaches 1% health, 3 side rooms open up and reveal the organs. These organs all spam cast Pumping Blood. If this cast goes uninterrupted, then it will spawn a Blood of Ny'alotha, an ad that will fixate on a random player and begin to chase them down. If this ad ever reaches their target and melee hits them, it applies Reoccurring Nightmare, which is a stacking dot that deals a huge amount of damage. This can however be dispelled. When the ads die, they deal a small burst of raid-wide damage. And one thing to note is that the ads can also be crowd controlled. So what you want to do the moment the phase begins is make sure that all of the organs have at least a 2-man interrupt rotation so that none of the ads spawns. And if one of them does accidentally spawn, all DPS should swap to it and kill it as soon as possible. Now whilst you can technically damage all of the organs at the same time, it's completely pointless because the moment one of them dies, the others will heal back to full health and phase 1 begins again. So you'll want the entire raid to be on one of them, apart from the interrupt rotation groups that will be over there by themselves. Now whilst in this phase, players in the raid will be debuffed with Cursed Blood. This generates a massive targeting circle around you, dealing light ticking damage until it explodes 8 seconds later. This explosion deals a huge amount of damage to all players within the targeting circle. So to counter this, we always had a safe spot where people could remain stacked very close to the organ. The moment the debuffs came in, everyone afflicted can just move away from that safe spot, whilst making sure that they don't hit other people with the debuff. Once the organ is dead, phase 1 will begin again, but that particular organ will continue to spawn ads for the rest of the fight, and it cannot be interrupted. And in order to kill the boss, you need to kill all 3 organs and then do phase 1 one final time. So at the end of the fight, you're going to have swarms of ads coming in every 12 seconds or so, whilst dealing with the phase 1 mechanics, whilst trying to burn the boss. Which is where we get to the general strategy, mainly with the beams. So there are a lot of different options. The strategy we were using where the patches went through the boss works really well, as it gives you a lot of space in that last phase to kite and kill off ads, but that only really worked because the Tremor Totem could cheese the mind control. Although with timers you could probably still use that strategy, just not as cleanly as we were doing because of the overlaps. The strategy we used on Mythic instead also seemed quite effective. The idea is that patches cover areas of the room that you will not be using again in the future. So you start the fight in the entrance of the room and only place patches in this sort of quarter until phase 2 begins, at which point you move over to the first organ on the left hand side of the room. Once that phase is over, you stay in that area again for the duration of the next phase 1 and fill up that side until phase 2 begins, and then you move into the next quarter with the organ at the top of the room. You then repeat this movement until you get to the final phase with your final quarter, with ads spawning directly behind you and from the left and top organ, and just hope that you can kill the boss before you become overwhelmed. That, we think, will probably be the strategy that you use for a first kill on normal and heroic difficulty. Now, talking quickly about Mythic, the debuff in Phase 2 that generates a circle around you is now in all phases, and to add, it's now dispellable, but its damage it deals is based on the size of the targeting circle around the player, which grows and shrinks over its duration. Dispelling large circles in quick succession deals so much damage to the entire raid that it's very easy to one-shot everybody, so you've only got to dispel the small ones at all times. One thing that they've also added to the dungeon journal since our last test is that this new ad will be spawning in Phase 2 that charges around and eats all the blood adds, whilst gaining a 10% damage increase each time it does so. If this is something they've added to the fight to make dealing with the adds easier, or just to make the fight overall that much more difficult, is unclear at the moment, and we won't really know for sure until we see it on live servers. But anyway guys, that's the fight.
So as you said at the start of the fight, we definitely love this encounter. It's going to be really interesting how the additional add on Mythic works, and what strategy really will be best when it comes down to Phase 1. I also think it's really important that we do praise Blizzard here on making another fight that doesn't have a shitload of mechanics, yet is still really fun to play for pretty much all roles. Sometimes they do have these fights where you read the dungeon journal beforehand and you're thinking, wow, look at all of these abilities, there is far too much going on here, and then by the time you get to the boss you realise the majority of them are kind of irrelevant. This boss is the complete opposite. Everything that's in there is actually very important to the fight, and it's nice to see that. I think there's very little that needs to be changed on this fight. I mean, personally, I wouldn't change a thing. I think it's really, really good, and I cannot wait to see it on Mythic. I think it's going to be so much fun.
Well, yeah, it's amazing to see, once again, a fight where, yeah, there's like 4 mechanics per phase at a push, and there's so many different strategies. Like, we went over an entire strategy in this video that you probably won't even end up using on live servers, but the beams just disrupt movement so much, and everything else is movement-based. Like, if those beams didn't exist, you could just stack up, all the adds will funnel in, you just keep them at bay. With Rings of Peace and Mass Roots, you know, you could just keep them at bay and just absolutely nuke the living hell out the boss, but just that addition of that one little thing makes it so everything else becomes more complicated. Do you want to have everyone loosely spread out and trying to fill in the goo gaps around the sides of the room, or do you want to try and like move as a group through the middle of the boss? Like, there's so many different things that you can do for this fight, even though there's very few mechanics. It's going to be great to see what they do.
And there's also one thing that we didn't really touch on. Of course, we did mention that the ads can be crowd controlled, but there is technically a strategy you could do for last phase where the ads are permanently crowd controlled.
Yeah, they don't enrage or anything like that. Like, the actual achievement for this boss, like the meta achievement, is to kill 20 ads within like 10 seconds or something like that, or 10 ads, something like that. So it's, you know, the fight is built so you could keep them all at bay. So you could just bring like 15 druids and have like a mass roots rotation on every single organ that's continuously pumping out these ads. And in theory, that could work. Do you want to maybe keep an eye out on Method or Limit, like gearing up 15 druids on the down low just for this one particular fight? Because in theory, it'll make it a lot easier. Maybe. Oh, who knows?
But thank you very much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this preview, then do drop us down a like. And before you do go, make sure you check out our guide over on Wowhead. Whenever any changes are made to the boss or there's new strategies that have been formed, you can see them all over there. So we recommend you go see that. And we shall see you all in the next one.
Thanks for watching.